Hello.
Hello all. Good afternoon. Good Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, happy Sunday. Hope you're all doing well. It's 90 degrees here, so it's a little hot. But we're ready to drink some tea.
Good weather for Japanese tea. It tends to brew at a cooler temperature, so cooler being relative. So something not 90 degrees centigrade, closer to 70 degrees centigrade is pretty good. And it's nice. I'm also the type of person that likes drinking hot things on hot days, like most of the non-Western world. But yeah.
I was thinking earlier today that I should have started a cold brew for myself because I would like a cold drink. But I do enjoy warm drinks on hot days as well. It kind of helps regulate the body temperature a little bit more, which I need a lot of help with sometimes.
Today, Chase, we're doing this Japanese tea that we got and sent out. It's from our friends Chato out. They're based out of San Francisco area of California. Little Japanese tea company. You want to talk about some of this tea that we're going to drink?
So this month we have a sencha made with the Koshun cultivar, and we got a little bit into this in the periodical, talking about how the differences between Chinese and Japanese greens and tea in general, and how there's abundance of tea in both countries, but the way that the abundance appears is pretty differently, where Japan has a smaller number of the types of tea, and a lot of focus is placed on the cultivar used. So we have this one cultivar, Koshun, for today, but it might not taste like other cultivars used for sencha. It'll taste like sencha always, but Japanese tea really lets you kind of deep dive into the tasting notes of tea and do comparisons of very similar teas, which is why I really like it. You can see it's a very pale yellow liqueur, which is very typical of sencha.
And of a fair number of Japanese green teas in general. Some of that being, generally speaking, in the processing of Japanese teas, the oxygen fixing, so that is the halt in oxidation that is done, is via heat treating them. And in Chinese teas, generally speaking, that is done via pan frying, a hot heat source. Like, think of a really huge wok, heated up really hot with leaves tossed around into it and kept moving. Japanese teas primarily tend to be steamed as opposed to pan fried. So you also get kind of different flavor notes from that to start with.
Yeah, so those flavor notes typically, when you're comparing Japanese and Chinese green teas in particular, Chinese green teas tend to be a little bit sweeter, not sugary sweet, but like a softer palate.
Yeah.
Whereas Japanese teas tend to be a little bit more intense, a little more astringent, forward in the vegetable flavors. And that's because of the processing styles of pan fried and steamed.
You want to talk about some of this? Well, is it a cultivar actually, or is it?
It is a cultivar.
Okay.
It's, I want to say the 32nd cultivar recorded in Japan. I could be very, very wrong, because I kind of deep dived into the history of cultivars in Japan, which is kind of a recent history. So someone said the first impression of the aroma is spinach in a good way. And yes, that's very typical of sencha and Japanese green teas. You'll get a lot of green vegetable flavors in particular.
Yeah.
I think that this one has a little bit of a broccoli note to it, because it's kind of a subtle but still green flavor. I have to go back to my train of thought.
You were talking about it being potentially the 32nd cultivar
Yes.
and a little bit of the history of cultivation of tea and classification of cultivars in Japan.
Yeah. So there are two methods for growing the plants in general, but tea plants specifically, and that's clones and I don't know the actual word for, but like natural.
A sexual reproduction of plants. So it's the seeding, pollinating, and growth from seed versus
growth from clones or other things. So when we're talking cultivars, we're talking specifically clones, where parts of plants are taken to create a new plant. And this, of course, has the risk of entire plots of land being open to disease, and that does happen very frequently, particularly before pesticides existed. Crops could be devoured and destroyed very easily.
So in growing in Japan, tea, does it tend to go in the direction of a monoculture? So it's all the same plant growing, therefore anything that happens could mess everything up?
Yeah, so the very first cultivar created in Japan, Yabukita, became known as the Japanese palette cultivar, where somehow or another it was decided that the Japanese people would prefer the flavor of the Yabukita cultivar over every other cultivar. And so by the 1990s, Yabukita was 80 or 90% of what was grown for the tea acreage in Japan. And that affected the economy, that affected like disease among crops very quickly. But thankfully during that, getting to the 90%, people were already starting to play with creating new cultivars, trying to prevent disaster countrywide with tea. And there has been a huge incentive to try to get more cultivars in. Now we're about 75% of tea crops being Yabukita, and everything else is something else. Koshun was created in 2000 or recorded officially in 2000. I'm not exactly sure when it was created. So it is a fairly new cultivar in the scope of things, keeping in mind that Yabukita was created in, I want to say 1908. But it was only officially recorded in 1952 when the records started. You're giving me a look like I said the wrong date.
No, just it's weird how that lines up with, full-on Meiji restoration hitting real hard.
It was like, this is a huge product of the Meiji Restoration. If anyone knows Japanese history, the Meiji Restoration pretty much affected the entire country and turned it all on its head.
Essentially, it was the Japanese royal families and society at large and the upper echelons looking towards Germany and saying, let's do that, and got very Western.
Split between Germany and the US, depending on which things they were looking at, because the Japanese constitution is very US based.
Yes.
But the train systems, for example, are very German.
We had a question in the chat, someone asking, going back to cultivation of the tea plant, of whether or not primarily it's done via grafting or by slips. From everything that I could find, generally speaking, it tends to edge towards slips as opposed to grafting, but
what's the difference between the two? I honestly don't know.
Got to go back to some botany.
Yeah, I have very little actual botany
Right.
knowledge.
So grafting is a method where, if I can remember things correctly, is you take a living plant, generally a trunk or something, and a cutting of a branch of the plant that you want to be growing, and you'll cut them in very particular ways and kind of marry them together, and they'll grow together and go from that. Slips, I can't remember other than they're not that off the top of my head, and I apologize for that.
If you know how to define slips, please write in the comments.
Yeah, and we'll share with everyone.
Together.
My old botany teacher is definitely being like, "Come on, I taught you this. It was on a quiz and everything." But that's that. Getting to this tea and this sencha, it's, to me, like super spinachy, as was stated, and it's bright, a little sharp, and relatively acidic. It's also got very much, for me, seaweed notes, like a wakame kind of seaweed, which is also a fun thing that you can do with sencha, especially, which is after you have spent the leaves and they're wet and you're not really getting much flavor out of them, making them into a salad with like a seaweed salad with things, or just over and mixed into some rice, can be really nice. We're getting some folks talking about the grassiness in it, which is definitely, I think, predominant in the Koshu.
Yeah, particularly sweet grass.
Yeah.
Koshun is a sweeter cultivar for sencha. Many other cultivars used to make sencha have much more bitterness to it. So I think of like vegetables I don't like, so asparagus and a lot of others.
Asparagus and vegetables with high amounts of vitamin A.
Yeah, I struggle with vitamin A vegetables, but this one almost has a fruitiness to it. I pick up notes of peach, particularly when it's cold brewed. I don't know if anyone has tried it cold brewed. I highly recommend it. Japanese green teas do really well cold brewed for the most part, and this one I really enjoyed when I tried.
Alternatively, also what's can be fun with Japanese teas is doing a flash chilled brewing method, which I might get into next tea chat that we have, because that's
we're going to talk about brewing methods.
Next tea chat, I'm way more excited about than this one. Not that this one isn't nice.
This is just more my playing field and stuff.
But it's taking a relatively large amount of leaf and a small amount of hot water, still brewing at 75, 80 degrees centigrade, over a few hundred grams of ice. So you're actually diluting it and chilling it that way.
Yeah, so going back a couple comments, is it used for tea leaf salad?
Yeah, very much. And then also, thanks to our friend Tom, slips are as cuttings for propagation. Okay, that makes sense. And make roots for planting, like cloning. Yeah,
so I've seen the word clone a lot when researching cultivars. So it's probably the slips method that is used. And this is like specifically cloning is used to keep the flavor palette pretty narrow and unique to the specific cultivar, instead of whitening it up to possible changes.
Yeah, possible changes that might happen from cross-pollination.
Yeah. Particularly in Japan, the tea farms are a lot more manhandled in Japan than in China overall.
Yeah. More. If you look for any images, we'll try to figure out a way how to get images in these chats.
Eventually, we'll learn technology, but not today.
But Japanese tea plantations, generally speaking, look more manicured.
Mm-hmm.
So there's rows and rows and rows of very finely shaped hedges of tea. And that's done via these really cool contraptions, which are like lawnmowers that just float over.
Mm-hmm.
Also, with that, you get a lot shorter leaves, generally speaking, and a lot sharper cut leaves in Japanese tea production than in Chinese.
Yeah. In pretty much every step of tea, not the word harvest, tea growing, tea farming, cultivation, there we go. Japan typically uses machinery. Almost nothing is done by hand anymore in Japan, and it's because of the strict uniformity desired in the end product, both flavor-wise and shape-wise of the leaf. If you look at the leaf of a Japanese green tea versus a Chinese green tea, you'll see a very stark difference of Japanese tea tends to look like little needles and be very uniform in shape and size. Chinese tea, even the ones that are not curled, that are flattened, aren't as uniform. And that's because Chinese tea is typically hand plucked more often than Japanese tea. And there are more steps that are still done in the traditional hand methods, whereas Japan is almost all machinery.
I was able to pull up in here and this really great book, Tea Histories, Terroir Varieties, put out by the folks Camilla Sinensis Tea House up in Montreal. They've got this great photo of a Japanese tea farm. And so you'll see all of those little hedges with rows in between them. And it's very, very manicured.
Yeah.
And I'll see if I can pull up.
Yeah. By comparison, tea plantations in China tend to have a more zigzag pattern. So it's not straight rows. It's kind of like how some people, how I in particular put cookies on a cookie sheet where you have like a row of 3 and a row of 2. So you kind of skip over and it has utilizes the space really effectively in a very different way.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of that also can do with the general landscape that is in China versus Japan. Both can be counted as mountainous territories, but Japan has less space to spread out than China does. So all of their choices tend to be a little more German in the.
What I did find really interesting about this, going back to the history of cultivation in Japan, is that before the Meiji Restoration, tea plantations were all in the mountains in Japan. And this is also before most machinery was used. And then the Meiji Restoration happened, and there was incentive to have larger tea plantations and make tea a bigger factor in the country's economy. And so a large portion of the land not in use by cities were given to tea farmers and old samurai families in flatter lands. And so we're not seeing as much tea growth happen in Japan in the mountains anymore. It's in the valleys, and so it's even more confined space typically. And then whereas in China, tea is grown both in the valleys and in the mountains and is a little bit more spread out. And you see a lot more wild grown teas, which are plants that are left alone for the most part until harvest time, whereas that doesn't happen in Japan. Any thoughts or questions about this tea or Japanese teas as we're enjoying this tea together this month? We had some great tasting notes in the comments earlier. If there's any other tasting notes that weren't mentioned, let us know if you found something shine through for your palate.
Either good or not.
Yeah, you don't have to like the tea that we send you, but we try to send you tea that's good.
Yeah. That's at the very least interesting.
Yeah.
I, for one at least, am not a huge fan of Japanese green teas most of the time. Mm-hmm. They tend to be that sharp, a little more acidic. For me, for that reason, they're very nice midday teas. Kind of let that, like, oh, cool, like check in with self. How is it going?
It's like the tea to replace a siesta, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I often forget how much I enjoy Japanese green teas, and the main reason why I don't drink them as much as I want to is because they tend to be short-lived in comparison to many other teas. You typically get 2 to 3 infusions out of a Japanese green, whereas when I drink tea, I kind of want to forget where I'm at in the process. And so I much would rather have a tea that could go like 5 or 6 infusions or more. I also typically drink tea when I'm working, either in the shop or on my computer, or like just doing something else. So Japanese teas definitely make me stop and slow down a bit because they're so short, and I want to make sure I appreciate them.
Yeah, there's something about them that demands a little more attention. Generally speaking, I find
they are very sensitive to time and temperature compared to many other teas as well.
So you can definitely do the thing where you oversteep or scorch the leaves.
Yeah.
And you go, well,
that's done.
Get to retry all of that again.
Well, it'll just get real bitter and astringent, and you won't enjoy it.
Very nice. But also, because of that, as we're talking about tea, and this tea, it also, because of, I think it's light, fresh, and like sharpness of it, it goes really well with vegetable dishes, as well as white fish dishes, steamed fish, or the such. Like, it really punches through.
Yeah.
Someone's talked about not yet trying it iced, but wants to give that a shot.
Yeah. I highly suggest, I haven't flash chilled this, but if you're going to cold brew it, definitely give it at least 4 hours. And it doesn't need to be cold water. It can be room temperature, but just don't make it warm. Just put it in a cup or a pitcher, however much you want. I would do about 2 grams per cup, I think is what I wrote down in the suggestions. But yeah, give it some time. It'll take a long time for it to get horribly astringent as well.
Yeah, someone's also talked about in the brew instructions that we sent out, we had, I want to say, like a minute-long infusion suggestion for the first infusion, and then going to 20 seconds or 30 seconds or much shorter second and third infusions. And that is something that we've discovered happens because of how much the leaf is up, and because of how it's cut, there's a lot more surface area. and you'll really get in there, and they'll expand. And I'm actually going to try to pick out some of these spent leaves to show you what I mean.
It's that style of brewing where the first infusion is significantly longer than the second and third. It's all being really short in the span of things, but that's a very typical style for Japanese teas, and it is because they are so sensitive. And Tim was kind of giving you the reason, or one of the reasons why it's so sensitive. The leaf, after it's opened up and no longer in its needle shape, is small and torn for the most part.
How well that appears on camera here.
Yeah. But so the more rips there are in the tea leaf, the faster it'll infuse, typically. So you'll also see this with many Indian teas, where if it's ripped, it'll infuse fast. That is good. Munch on your used leaves.
I'll wake you up.
Yeah. But yeah, you can definitely experiment, as we always encourage, experiment with your brewing and see how you in particular like this tea, and let us know if you find something drastically different than what we've suggested to be enjoyable, and we'll play with it too. What we suggest is kind of just what we've discovered over time and over playing with particular teas.
Yeah. Someone's also talked about it being really good, goes really well with sweets, especially mochi. Mochi, for the uninitiated, is a rice, pounded rice dessert, Japanese rice dessert. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mochi also just means rice.
It's also, well, it's a type of rice.
Yeah.
There's a lot of types of rice in the world.
Sorry.
But that comment's also kind of fun because Japan really solidified the usage of sweets to complement tea, in particular the Cha-no-yu, the Japanese tea ceremony that we talked about a little bit last month. And that's transferred over to other teas because of kind of the natural growth of tea culture in Japan, stemming directly from matcha and the Cha-no-yu and into other teas. So almost all teas kind of go really well with little treats in Japan.
Mm-hmm. Tampopo. Okay.
I don't think I've seen tampopo.
So there's a comment in the chat, really liking the sequence about mochi and the movie Tampopo. Odd but funny. Tampopo, old Studio Ghibli Hayao Miyazaki film, if I'm recalling if it actually is or if it was just adjacent. I'm not going to confirm myself with the internet.
I think it's a Ghibli. Unless it's Pompoko. Sorry, I'm zoning out and playing with tea leaf now because we've had a lot of tea.
Tampopo, right. It's a 1985 Western comedy set in Japan. Two Japanese milk truck drivers help a restaurant owner learn how to cook great noodles. And now I have a movie that I'm going to try to find and watch. So that's great.
There are very few requirements needed for Tim to be interested in a movie, and it being about noodles is definitely up on the list.
Definitely makes the list.
Yeah.
Yes. About noodles.
Yeah, Tampopo is about noodles. One thing I wanted to bring up before I forget is that we're changing our hours in the shop, and it's going to affect this YouTube live thing. because we will now be open on Sundays from 11 a.m. to 5 or 6 p.m. Yeah, till 6 p.m. And this is usually at 5 p.m. So we're trying to figure out the best time to do these YouTube live videos, either earlier or later on Sundays or maybe on a Monday. But let us know either in the comments.
Give us suggestions in the chat or in the comments of what your schedule looks like, what you like, and how you'd like to gather around tea.
If we stay on Sundays, it'll probably be like 9 or 10 in the morning, or like 7 or 8 at night, East Coast time. So like figure out when you want to be drinking tea with us. You could also not be drinking tea, and we'll just be caffeinated.
And say hi.
Yeah.
Which we're also very excited. This week we'll be opening up our tea house for the first time in 15 months. Yeah. For indoor dining, which will be nice. And we'd love to see some more folks in and share more tea with more people.
It seems like things are picking up around the state and town, and hopefully the nation and
the world at large.
So if you're ever in Burlington, like, come on in. We're gonna be open.
We'll be there, and we'd love to share some tea with you all. Then we'll start talking a little bit now about coming up next month. What the tea periodical and the chat will be less focused on a particular tea and more about brewing methodology. So we're going to take some of those things that we've learned thus far and have discussed and start to get into how to get better at brewing and different techniques for brewing tea, both culturally brewing tea as well as tea brewing innovations, cold brewing tea and the such, and kind of getting into some of those nitty-gritty things about when you might want to, or better phrasing, how to know the general guidelines or rules about when you want to brew in a method for a tea, and learning when and how you want to break those rules.
Basically giving you the tools for when we say play with how you brew, you'll kind of know what direction might be a good way to start.
Yeah, like that. We want to help folks become better brewers, and experimentation is number one, and number two is access to a variety of teas, and that's one of our main goals of this subscription group, and we're looking forward to pushing forward with that and keeping it going.
But I think that's all for today. I hope you all enjoy this tea for this month, and figure out how you like it, hot or cold.
And as always, we're so happy to share this time with you, to sit down and enjoy tea, enjoy company and conversation. And we hope you're able to sit down with people that you love and that you care about for tea and good conversations in the near future. Thank you, and have a great evening.
Have a good one.